obvious when you come here, whether you're a linguist or not, that people think there is a distinctive, they call it a language, sometimes they call it a dialect, they call it a, the way we talk. Sometimes people call it slang because they call everything non-standard slang. You can see this not only by listening to how people talk, but also by picking up all sorts of artifacts. One of the first ones I found was a little dictionary, a little folk dictionary with funny little drawings and kind of structured like an encyclopedia or a glossary from the back of a school textbook. It had words and definitions and then example sentences for each one. And it was all meant to be humorous, but it was about something that people thought really existed. Meanwhile, William Labov, who is doing his major linguistic atlas of North American English, had already pointed out that there was a distinctive area in southwestern Pennsylvania that was linguistically different from other areas. So coming at it from both directions, both the popular and the scholarly directions, it looked like there was really, there was something to study here, and almost nobody had ever really studied it. There had been a dialectologist a number of decades ago who sort of made a few stabs at describing what people here call Pittsburghese, but nobody really had taken it, had done serious work on it. So I got together with Professor Scott Kiesling, who was a colleague of mine at the University of Pittsburgh. There are two universities that are very close together, and people often work together across the two universities. And we applied for a grant and eventually got a grant and started doing field work, and that it sort of went from there. Another little point is that part of the reason I was inclined to get interested in Pittsburgh speech is because where I grew up is 120 miles from Pittsburgh, and some of the same things, the same words, the same kind of morphological or morphosyntactic structures, the same phonological features, you could hear where I grew up too. And yet here in Pittsburgh, people said, this is Pittsburghese, it doesn't exist anywhere else. This is the way we talk, nobody else talks this way. I knew that wasn't true. So I found it fascinating. We had built into the funding for the project money to assemble a group of people, both from here and from elsewhere, who could help us figure out what we wanted to know and how we should go about finding it out. It's called a community advisory board. And we had local historian, a couple of historian sociologists, people who knew a lot about Pittsburgh, and then we also had linguists who knew a lot about studying variation. And together, we met with them for a whole weekend and eventually decided that we wanted to do a combination of kind of a traditional sociolinguistic study where you go out and find a representative sample of people and interview them using a carefully designed protocol, set of questions so that you get all the linguistic information you need. But we wanted to combine that with something more ethnographic so that we were interested in how people lived, because we wanted to see if there were connections between people's lifestyles and their backgrounds, their lived experience, their beliefs, what they did for fun, all those things, and whether or not they would speak with the local accent or be able to talk about the local accent. So it was a combination of that sort of traditional tape recorded interview and a lot of ethnographic work, going out in the community and just noticing things, being a participant observer. And then we did some archival research too, looking for old recordings of people who might have been recorded before we could have possibly recorded them. used linguistic atlas of the old linguistic atlas of the North Atlantic states, just assembled information however we could. I'd say the thing that fascinated me the most was that Pittsburghese had a very interesting history, and this is not something I really expected to be looking into. So I found out gradually that the really interesting question for me was, where did this idea come from that there is a distinctive accent here? And just because I say, where does this idea come from, doesn't mean that the idea is wrong. If there is a distinctive accent here, but when and why did people start talking about it and thinking about it and writing it on t-shirts and coffee mugs and joking about it and making up little dictionaries of it? And I discovered that it didn't go very, very far back. This was not something that had been around forever. People may have been talking in a distinctive way in this area for a fairly long time, because the earliest English-speaking settlers brought their accent with them. And then the area became sort of isolated, or was sort of isolated. It's in the mountains, and there's a big mountain range to cross before you get to the Atlantic coast. So that accent kind of carried on and morphed, as accents do, into something more like what we hear now. But people did not notice that until after World War II, after the Second World War. That when people started noticing that they had an accent, then it was possible for them for the first time, if they noticed they had an accent, so they started to talk about it. And I just found it fascinating that to just uncover all the things that came together to make people notice that they had an accent. All the things about the history of the local economy and the kind of history of immigration to this area, and the history of, even labor relations, labor business relations. And it was just fascinating to see. I won't go into the whole story. You can read it for yourselves, but it was like the perfect storm of everything coming together to make people aware that they had an accent and that they should be proud of it, and that they should try to preserve it in certain ways, and that they could use it as a way to make money, in addition to a way to show their identity and their affiliation with each other. It's a little bit unintuitive. It's a little bit not what you would guess. The people who tend to have the most negative attitude about Pittsburgh speech are the people who have the strongest Pittsburgh accents. And that's because those accents are a liability to them. They have been told that if you talk that way, you won't get a job. You should. And there are people who will teach you how to not talk like a Pittsburgher, speech coaches and things like that. And the people who have the most positive attitude about Pittsburgh speech are the people who either don't even know how to speak like a Pittsburgher, or who have an option whether or not to speak like a Pittsburgher. So people who can, what sociolinguists call style switch, people who can sound pretty neutral and, standard American when they need to, and then sound more like a Pittsburgher when they need to. Those people tend to have stronger positive attitudes about Pittsburgh speech. And some of the people who just love Pittsburgh speech are people who can show off their knowledge about it to suggest that they are insiders, that they're in the know, that they're, that they're hip with what's going on, but who don't speak that way at all and couldn't even imitate what it means to speak that way. So it really has to do with how it affects you in your own lived experience, whether people have positive or negative attitudes about Pittsburgh speech.